Ross, good to see you, brother. I know it's been a couple months since we did. Is it a couple months? Yeah, I guess 2 months
Yeah.
almost since we did our virtual event, which I think a lot of people enjoyed. We still have, a bunch of content actually to post produce. It's one of those things where you do this stuff, you get a bunch of content, and then there's a lot of value on the back end to actually get the
Yeah.
content out. So, how you doing? Happy holidays.
Yeah, doing well, thanks. Yeah. It's been just got through Thanksgiving, so next up is Christmas. But yeah, it was always great to connect with you and especially connect and talk through sales. So
Awesome. Well, Ross, you've been in the space for a long time, and you're one of these friends that I've made virtually. We've never met each other, but I
yeah.
feel like you're like my cousin.
Yeah.
My cousin in Arizona.
Yeah.
Just having worked for a bunch of I think, gosh, right? Like our space is not 100 years old, right? We're not
Yeah.
CPG, right? Like if you say you've been in the space the last decade, you've basically been there since the beginning of this sort of like second or third wave of uh sales tools, of course CRM being that first kind of wave, and that's gone through a couple iterations. But let's dig in here to into B2B sales, and we've known that it's gotten a lot more challenging. We know we talk about that quite often. You see it over LinkedIn. You see everyone sort of giving their take on how to make it, and there's really like an increased amount of competitive options in the market, right? Tighter budgets, these sort of things. So we've really seen that. From your perspective, and of course the macro environment, the last almost 2 years, how can sellers continue, really frankly, to get deals done in a way that will allow them to hit their quotas, allow the organizations to be successful?
Yeah, it's a great question. I spent a lot of time thinking about this, both as an individual contributor, but also just really liking and being passionate about inside sales. And really, I think it's improving sales execution, right? Because if you think about it, to your point, it is more challenging than ever because buyers are doing more research on their own. And they're limiting the time that they spend with sellers. I can't remember the exact statistic, but it's like a nominal amount of time that buyers are, getting on Zoom calls or whatever with a seller. And when they get to those calls, they really expect just to have that exchange of information, the things they can't learn on their own, perhaps. And they're not really, they don't have a lot of patience for, the standard sales cycle. You'd mentioned if you've been in this space for a decade, you've seen things change drastically, and I think that that's true for me, and seeing how things have changed. But so I think it's having this limited time with the buyers, and really that means there's no room for poor sales execution, right? So imagine a sales rep, they walk into their Monday and they haven't prepared for any of their meetings, right? So they show up to that meeting and they're asking questions of things that they could have went and figured out before the call even started to set themselves up. Maybe they don't adhere to a sales process, so maybe they're just sort of flying by the seat of their pants and not following the proven best practices that their sales manager or organization has rolled out. So things like that then tend to lead into poorly run discovery calls, or poorly run demos, and ultimately those things, that's where reps lose deals.
We were talking a little bit about the average salesperson versus those top performers, and it's interesting because you highlighted this idea that your sales managers put together best practices, hopefully, right? Has designed a sales motion, and you're thinking to yourself, why wouldn't I use that? Like, why would you still show up to meetings unprepared and these sort of things, right? And so it just really baffles me to think that salespeople are still doing that, and that's really more of a human thing, right? If you gosh, if you don't prepare for a meeting and you show up and you're just sort of like very unstructured, I mean, you're sort of like limiting your ability to be successful, right? In there, like you're not controlling the variables that it can inevitably show up, right? But if I'm prepared and I'm limiting the number of variables that I don't have any insight into, like I mean, logic just tells you, right, that you're gonna at least have a better chance of winning that deal or moving it forward.
Yeah, I mean, there's lots of things that you can control, and of course, there's things you can't control in a deal. But the things that you can control should absolutely be, be accounted for. And I think that that's often, I've heard somebody I really respect actually, they articulate this concept in operating well in the margins. So it's like, what are those things that you do around your deals that you can control to be excellent, right? To operate well in the margins. And I think going back to your original question, how can people, win deals in this environment? I think it's improving sales execution, and you do that by focusing on those things you can control and operating well in the margins.
What are some of the things that you've seen tops reps be able to do to better prepare? Maybe we can start off at that level. So
Mhm.
pre call to be able to better prepare in this world, right? The world that we
Mhm.
live in right now, going into 2024. So with all the tools and so on that you have access to, so yeah, so being able to prepare for a call, and then maybe we can dive in after that into like running a better discovery.
Yeah, I think it's pretty simple. It's I like to think of it as digging into the individual. So who's the person you're going to meet with? What's their buyer persona? What are the typical things that buyer persona is challenged with that you can, sort of speak to? You want to know things about their tenure, maybe their experience. A lot of times people put these very specific responsibilities in their role listed right on their LinkedIn. So you can come prepared with that type of information on the individual. The next thing I like to do is dig into the actual company. So look for any recent press releases or, things that could, I call compelling events that would insinuate or indicate that there's some sort of compelling event prompting them to be interested in your solution. And so arming yourself with that, whether it be, maybe their sales team headcount has grown by 30% in the last 6 months. So maybe if you sell a sales technology, that's something that you could come armed to the call to speak to on how they might use your technology for onboarding or supporting a growing sales team. So digging into the actual company. And then the third thing would be industry. So there's oftentimes industry trends or things that are going on. Again, these could be leading into compelling events that your solution might help them address. So for example, this is a little bit aged now, but when GDPR was coming out, all the craze was how are we going to protect consumer data? And if you were in a space that had a solution for that, that would definitely be a trend that you'd want to come prepared to speak to on that call. So I think uncovering things like that about the individual, the company, and the industry are really important. But also, and this one surprisingly is often overlooked, but dig into your CRM and look at the past engagements that you or your team have had with this person or this company. And it might not be in CRM. It might actually be in your Gong or your Chorus, your call recorder, which is probably more likely. But digging into any past engagements that you or your team has had with this individual or company, and bringing those insights to the call to ask them, well, what's changed now versus when we met last time. Some of the basics I would say as far as pre-call research goes for me.
And when you think of a poorly like conducted discovery call, what does that look like from your perspective?
Yeah, I think it's hard because you want to strike this balance of where it's structured, but you don't want to be too overly formal.
Mm,
And so it's, showing up and offering to open up the conversation with something around business rapport. So something related to their role, their responsibilities, their company, versus, maybe the more how's the weather, where are you located, how was your weekend, things of that nature. So in my opinion, and this is just an opinion, strong opinions weakly held. People can feel free to change my mind, but I think it's more effective to set up a business conversation with that business rapport. And then, having just a simple upfront agenda, really, of
Mm.
here's what we're going to work on in this call. Here's the two outcomes we could have. Either one is fine, but having some sort of like structure to get that call going is, in my opinion, a way to set up a productive conversation.
Yeah, setting that stage I think is so important when, getting ahead of it, sort of like being able to set the expectations and then opening up the opportunity to say, all right, well, here's what we've accomplished, here's what we've discussed, here are the potential outcomes. Should we go right or left? Right. And
Mm-hmm.
sort of
Yeah.
like getting them to or setting them up for that. So when you get to that step, it's not I think sometimes some sales reps it's awkward to slide into that if you're just sort of all over the place and you haven't structured that expectation.
Yeah. Yeah. And it can be hard. I mean, if you go from talking about your weekend or your favorite sports team, and then all of a sudden you hit somebody with that agenda, and it feels very rigid. So it can be hard to follow some sort of structure. But I think if you can figure out how to, massage your process and delivery of that to where it comes off genuine, and I think that the buyers ultimately respect that because they no longer think you're going to be here wasting their time. But then also you're setting yourself up for a more productive conversation. So.
Yeah. One thing that I always add is, okay, just want to do a time check. How are you on time? Do you have a hard stop? These sort of things, right? Just giving them that impression that I'm respecting their time, to your point, but also, understanding kind of do I have some leeway there, right?
Yeah.
Sometimes if they do say, oh, I got a hard stop or whatnot, that might indicate something or might not, right? It's sometimes if they're like, oh, I have some extra time, then I go, okay, I got someone potentially, and this is potentially a little more open-minded,
Mm-hmm.
or believes that what we're discussing here today is going to be something that they'll prioritize. So that makes a lot of sense to me. You talked also a little bit about some of the other stuff that reps do, like talk too much and they fail to listen, mishandle common objections, incorrectly address competitors. I think that's a big one there, just from a variety of reasons, but also like forgetting to establish those next steps, which are pretty nuts. Like in your experience as a rep, but also as a sales enablement leader, why do you think sales teams and reps are actually like continuing to make these types of mistakes?
Yeah, you listed off some there that hit close to home, I think, for a lot of folks. I really do think it's because there's maybe a lack of focused coaching, right?
Mm.
And so I've been working remotely for going on 6 years. And so my perspective is through the remote lens, which I think compounds this exponentially. But even if you're on the sales floor, there needs to be this level of individualized and focused coaching. And I think that sales managers are tasked with a lot to do. And unfortunately, the focused coaching effort sort of takes that back seat, and it's really hard to do that consistently. So I think that that's probably a big contributor. Again, remote environment compounds that exponentially, and how challenging it is to do that level of coaching. But then, if you think about the average tenure of a sales rep, I think is now around 14 months. And let's say you have 3 months of ramp in there. So that gives you just under a year of productivity with that sales rep to really focus in on some sort of, skill development. And that's not a lot of time. And like I said, not to be repetitive, but sales managers don't have enough time
Yeah.
as is. And so I think, all of that sort of just compounds together to where reps aren't getting the focused, individualized coaching they need.
Ross, you mentioned, a couple things, right? Like the tenure is much shorter than maybe we would have wanted, which really kind of limits your ability to adequately onboard and get someone really rocking and rolling. I think the other variable that we tend to maybe not appreciate as much. Although some leaders that I talk to, they pretty much understand like the value of being in person and remote work. But that remote work, it does have an impact on your ability to coach and connect with folks. And then lastly, like, just boy, like sales managers, how many are actually really good coaches? This is something that I saw over and over and over and over and over in my career, right? Where you have like a really rock star salesperson who's crushing it on closing deals. So then leadership's like, oh, let's put Sally or Joe into a leadership position, and then they're just not made to coach and lead other people. They're really good at leading themselves, but there's just a level of empathy and compassion and desire to want to make other people great, right? That I think is unique. So, given all these variables, what can we do as leadership teams to be able to improve, right? And be able to rectify some of these issues that we're seeing out there. I know there's a lot on that list, but maybe if we started off with like the remote piece.
Yeah, I think when it comes to improving sales execution, it really does come down to individualized coaching from a sales manager, or there are some reps out there who will go seek that training or coaching outside of their organization if they're not getting it. Maybe joining other sales networks, or like other thought leaders that they might follow and things of that nature. I remember when I would always read a lot of books, listen to a lot of podcasts, take away those best practices, and then incorporate them into my day-to-day. And then over time, those sort of things just compound up, and you look around and you're all of a sudden you're following a lot of best practices that you've just learned along the way. And so I think that resourceful reps can learn them that way as well. But as far as from a sales team, I think it starts with identifying the problem area. So not necessarily the sales skill that might be lacking, but the problem area that's in the metrics. So maybe you have a really long sales cycle, or you have a really low win rate. And once you identify what are those problem areas, then you can understand the selling skills that would help improve those, right? So if you have a really long sales cycle, maybe you can deduct from that our reps aren't setting or establishing next steps or keeping momentum in the deal, right? Or if you have a low win rate, maybe reps aren't speaking to objections or competitors effectively when they come up in the conversation. So it really starts with, and this was a great thing about call recording, is having that access to what used to be a black box. You can now see or listen rather to all those conversations and really understand where the real skill gaps are, related to some of those sales problem areas. So I think it's really just starts with understanding what the problem areas are related to your sales motion, and then understanding the skills that would, if we improve these skills, would help address those, and then identifying those within the team.
I wanted to double click on incorrectly speaking to competitors, because I think that time and time again, we maybe approach competitors with a negative view and a very defensive view. I think that's like, I don't know. I don't think that's a winning approach, right? Like, if you're Shaq, Shaquille O'Neal, if everyone hopefully everyone is aware of Shaq here, but he's, for you who are not familiar, is a really incredible former NBA player. And I just would say that he was the best center, right, ever in the NBA. And when you hear him talk, like, he doesn't, he just knows that he's really incredible, right? That he was the best, right? And he was just, and I think that there's a way to speak to competitors in that way where you're like, look, we know we're phenomenal, right? You have that energy, you have that approach, and you don't have to bad talk competitors, right? And I think that sometimes sales reps will become very defensive and actually say things that are not actually true about competitors. And I think that's one of the quickest ways to lose trust, with your prospects, right? Because then they go back and do research and go, oh boy, George over there at XYZ company told me that these guys were doing this or weren't doing this, and they are, and like, oh, now can I trust, George as a rep, right? So what would you say are like the best ways or very effective ways of actually addressing competitors?
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. And I actually was fortunate to learn this early on from an individual that I worked with, another sales rep. But I think if you take anything away, the first thing you say, or rather ask in that scenario is, oh, have you looked at them already? What did you like about them? Right. So you just turn that back around with questions. And, more often times than not, the prospect's going to tell you when you ask them what you liked, they're probably going to start telling you what they didn't like. So there's really eliminates you as the sales rep from having to sling any mud. But if you get really good at speaking to competitors, the theory is called the inoculation effect. So basically, it requires a little research beforehand, but if you understand the 2 to 3 things that your competitors typically say about you, you can almost plant those in your prospect's mind, right? So, George, let's say you were to ask me what I think about my competitor. I'm going to respond and say, well, I think that they're a great company. Although if you ask them, they're probably going to tell you that we're a small company, that we don't have a great support model because we don't, have a big team, and that we've only raised 1 round of funding, and so we might not be in business tomorrow, right? So just planting that in their mind as to what my competitor is going to say about me. Now all of a sudden they're going to go back and they're going to talk with the competitor, and when they do hear the competitor say those things, they're going to say, oh, Ross was right. He
Yeah.
told me they were going to say that. And you almost win them over through this like little mind Jedi trick. Again, that takes more experience, and you have to know what your competitors say about you. But I think it's a really great tactic that I was fortunate to learn early on.
I love that. I really do. One of the things that I always did was say exactly what you said, right? Like, so and so, really great company, but here's some things to consider, right? So, because I just have heard there was a company I worked for over the last couple of years, we would get gong recordings and stuff, right? Of competitors speaking so poorly about us
Mhm.
as an organization. And sure, people would get all worked up and, et cetera, internally and get upset. But in my mind, like that was, lack of class for sure, but also like being able to now turn around into your point and use it sort of against them in this chess match, right? So, whatever that looks like to you folks out there listening, I think that's a really great approach. Ross, if you were to think about some ways that very specifically, right, we spoke about some of the ways that, sales or organizations or sales teams were coming up short. But if you were to think about some of the ways they can actually optimize what they're doing from a sales execution perspective, what are some of those kind of tactics that you would recommend sales leaders look into working with their reps on actually implementing?
Yeah, it's honestly there's really not an easy way necessarily, and I think everybody wants the easy button, right? But just from my own experience as a rep, it's often been documenting out what is our sales process, what are the selling activities that we do within each of the stage, what are the events that take place within discovery, demo, proposal. So looking at it from a sales stage perspective and understanding what are the events that take place and what are the seller activities that need to happen in each of those stages. And then to go into that a little further, it's okay, here's the event that happens. So the quote unquote discovery call, right? So what does that discovery call look like if it's ran really well? What's the format of the call? So pre-call, what should the reps come prepared with? During the call, what questions should they ask and uncover? Or what should the agenda be? And then what questions should they ask and information they should uncover? And then what are the value prop talking points that they need to deliver in order to get to the next event and the next stage, which usually is like the demo, right? And then so it's breaking down the sales process and then really going deep within each of those events and seller activities and creating, a step-by-step guide, right? When I was an individual contributor, I did this religiously in a Google Doc on here's how I'm going to run my discovery calls. And I would print off a new one for each call. and I would follow it and take my notes right on there. And it worked really well, right? And we've now since productized that with OverQuota, but that really is that's the whole. It starts out with doing these things that don't seem very scalable, and then really figuring out how to make them specific for your sales motion. Yeah.
Ross, how do we get our reps to care, to really give a shit, right? Like, and
Yeah.
consistently do these things? There's been a common theme, right, throughout this discussion, which is like, if I knew that there were strategies that were going to help me, again, limit the unknown, control the variables as much as I can, and increase my sales, why would I not do this? And there's some human thing internally that I think is behind all this, right? Like some of the greatest sales leaders I've ever met or worked for, I should say, got me so fired up, right? They got me so fired up that I wanted to like be a master at my craft, right? I wanted to prepare properly. I wanted to write out things, like you said, processes and so on beforehand. So how do we get them to just care more?
Yeah, that's a really good question. I think,
Right? Ultimately, right?
I mean, if we solve that on this conversation, I think then we can blow up our LinkedIn and walk away. I think we got it figured out. No, I think it really comes down to understanding the motivations. I think a lot of reps are motivated by money. So it's how do we pay them more and how do we incentivize them with the appropriate, commission structure. So for example, if you're trying to drive multi-year deals, how do we add kickers on years 2 and 3 to incentivize reps to push multi-year deals? So little levers like that, maybe for those money motivated reps. But I think it probably runs a little bit deeper. I think it's how do we get reps excited about the company and the mission and the problems that we're solving. And that's one I don't have a great answer to, but I think it really does go deeper because where I've done some of my greatest work, it's having a really aspirational leader that is really excited about what we're doing in that space and looking up to them. And that has been the difference between, me jumping on an email at 6 a.m. for a prospect to have a quick turnaround on a proposal versus me waiting until, 8:30 or 9 a.m. after my typical day start. Right.
Yeah.
And so I think it's when you really look up to those leaders and you're so tightly aligned with the company mission and you're excited about the problem and the way you guys are solving it. And so I feel like it really goes back to that.
Yeah. Leadership by example. What do those inspirational leaders look like, right? We have to ask ourselves, and I know what they look like for me, but I think reps out there, I think that's really important when you're looking for roles as well. Like, is this leader the type of leader? I know that's something that I always looked at, and it proved to be effective time and time again. Because when things are slow or you're sluggish or things like that, that leader who's going to hop on lead, right?
Mm-hmm.
Not a order provider or a dictator, right? It's it's a leader. It's an inspirational individual. It's a motivating individual. These sorts of things I think are super important. And so being able to look for those attributes in someone that you're going to work with, I think is super important. I don't know that you can be a top rep for a long time under circumstances that don't have those attributes.
Yeah, it's really hard. And I still do prioritize that. Of course, you want to appreciate and enjoy who you work with. But it's really hard because I feel like if you base your decision solely on the leader and you go to this company, it could be 6 months and that leader has moved on. Right. So I think it's sort of this like tricky balance you got to find. And I've had that before with somebody I know that we both really respect actually. But I think it's somebody who has really strong character and who clearly is invested in you and making you, you better, right? So somebody who doesn't just get on the deal review call to do the hype man type stuff of like, probing and pushing you to do this or that, but somebody who would get on a deal review and dig into your deals and offer you alternative perspectives and, tactical things that you can go and do, actual support. I think those are the types of leaders that you want to look for, and the ones that you would push extra hard at the end of quarter to help hit the number with, right?
Yeah. I love that you just pointed that out, because what does that actually look like? So for you sales managers out here, right, who are clueless, what that means is not just saying, here are the 10 things that suck, or you should do differently, or this is wrong, this is wrong, this is wrong. Because let me tell you, most of the time your sales reps are going to walk out of there going, holy shit, right? Like this,
Yeah.
this person sucks, they're a jerk, right? They just just bashed me for 45 minutes or whatnot. And even if that wasn't your intention, words matter, communication styles matter, right? So you as a leader, you have to be more intentional. You have to look at it from a much higher lens or perspective, right? So yes, you should point out those things that they have to improve on, or that you recommend they improve on, right? But again, the way you communicate it, what you say is really important, but then also being able to highlight the things that they did really well. And I know when you're in a call with your rep and you got 30 minutes or you got 45 minutes and you don't have the time, frankly, these are the trade-offs that you're gonna have to make. And we hear it all the time, right, Ross? Like, you see how reps will walk out of meetings, or you'll be at happy hour with them, they're like, man, my manager sucks, right? They're this and that and the other thing. And what I believe is the case for the majority of these situations, is actually what we're discussing right now. It was not that the manager was trying to be a jerk or whatever. It was just the way that they were communicating, what they prioritize, and that they didn't highlight the things to actually uplift. I think you have to walk away from meetings having uplifted your rep, right? And this
Yeah.
is in our relationships in general, right? In our
Yeah.
interpersonal relationships, with our family, our friends, etc. If you're just poo-pooing on every bad thing that the other person has done or whatever, that's just how they're going to walk away from the conversation feeling like, right?
Yeah. Yeah. It's hard to build strong, lasting relationships, with poor communication, of course. And I think that, sort of goes back to what we were talking about earlier, like the remote environment makes that even more challenging. So figuring out how to be an effective communicator and leader virtually, that should be a required reading almost, if that's the the scenario that you're leading in, right?
Yeah, just don't be the talking head on Zoom that's just negative all the time, right?
Yeah.
You have to think about if there's a lot of negative. Again, I'll say it one more time. Like, if there are a lot of negative things that you've seen or things that need to be improved, you absolutely have to address them, obviously. But you have to think about how you address them in a way that's going to actually be uplifting and get people fired up, right? And part of that, frankly, is being able to lead by example. Is like, I will show you. It's not being the basketball coach. As you can tell, I love basketball. It's not being
Yeah.
the basketball coach who's like, you shot that wrong, or that you did that wrong. Only it's saying, hey, let me show you how you shoot, right?
Yeah.
Let me sit there next to you and do it,
Yeah.
right? Or here are the things that I saw that maybe if you did differently, you can improve your conversion rate. Let me jump on a call and actually walk you through and show you how to do it, right? And let's
Hmm.
practice it together, right?
Yeah.
And again, this also goes back to limited time and resources and these sort of things, right? Because how many times can sales managers actually be able to do what I just suggested?
Hmm.
It's
Yeah.
tough, especially if they're doing a lot of different things. But frankly, for the leaders out there, again what the trade-offs are going to be, right? You're going to have poor performance from reps, poor morale, and et cetera, if you don't do these things. And so you as a leadership team, overall have to figure out how to work these things in there.
Yeah. And I think some of the greats I've seen, they find a way to make it co-ownership of these things. So, there's a team film review, for example, where reps bring examples of calls snippets of calls that they want to review with the team. And maybe this week we're focused on how do we handle this objection or speak to this competitor. And, then it's almost like this, it's owned by the individual, but it's also something that the team does collectively and the manager can weigh in. So that's like a
Yeah.
really good way I've seen that done. Another one I've seen is, reps come to deal reviews, having gone through and stress tested all of their deals through like a checklist almost. So if, let's say, you follow Medic, for example, you would go through each deal and you would evaluate the deal through this checklist. And then when you come to deal review, it's, here's a visual of where the gaps are at. And so it allows you to, as a manager, to jump into those specific things and be very focused. And like you said, show reps how to shoot the basket versus, just standing on the sidelines. So those are just a couple of little things that I feel can really help boost morale and motivate people, outside of the compensation stuff we talked about.
Yeah, totally. Well, I think money levels out at some point, right? Like the
Yeah.
incentives for money. It's not $20 million, right? Like for the most part per rep, right? It's not some big, massive thing. So, the journey has to be sustainable and has to be pleasant, or else it's very difficult. And it's fine to be in a challenging environment externally, but internally it has to be rock solid. You can't be battling on every front, every like aspect of your existence within an organization. You can't be battling on the front lines with prospects and competitors, and then also internally, right? You have to have that solid team internally. You have to trust your leaders. You have to trust your fellow colleagues as well. And again, the top organizations that I've been part of, that's an element that they have, right? Everyone's got each other's backs, and you really feel that. And so for the sales leaders out there, you might not want to do this, right? You might be scared to see what the responses are, but I would go to your reps, maybe do an anonymous survey or whatnot, and ask, are you scared to show your film, right? You talked about those like film reviews. If they're scared, if they feel like it's not a empowering environment, you got a problem. You got a problem.
Yeah.
It's that easy. If you can't show up as a rep, and on the other side, right? If you can't show up as a rep to a meeting with your manager because you think you're going to be reprimanded or whatnot, again, that's a problem. And you got to ask yourself, am I working for the right leader? And if you do feel like that, I highly recommend figuring out a way to communicate that, or managing up to your leader and say, hey, here's the sentiment, here's how this feels, here's why maybe I feel this way, and here are some of the things that maybe I came up with that might be able to fix that. And guess what? If the manager's egotistical or truly a jerk, and their response is not great, it's just a matter of time where that's not going to be sustainable for you. Unfortunately, we have to be better leaders today, right? That's our deal. Right? We see that in our governments in the world, like we have to be better leaders. Okay. I'm very passionate about that concept, just because
an important topic.
it makes a lot of sense. Right. And I think that that's what makes or breaks organizations. Right. So, well, Ross, anything else that comes to mind around really optimizing, sales organizations and their productivity here before we wrap up today?
I think the last thought was, we talked a little bit about money motivated, and I think there are some reps that are money motivated. And to your point, it's not going to be a life-changing amount of money. But I think when I think back to, and maybe hopefully this is some helpful, experience that I've had that maybe other managers could use. But when I think back to when I was effectively motivated by the comp plan, it was the manager took the time to understand my personal life and what I was going to use that money for. Right. And so at that point in my life, I was trying to buy my first house. And, that's something that I talked with my manager about in our one-on-one. And, they took an interest in that with me. And then when we talked about comp, or we talked about, hitting quota each quarter, it was, that's going to help your down payment type of that was in the conversation. And I think that really helped, I guess, the money motivated aspect of it, versus just talking about, a $500 bonus. It was always about what are you going to do with that $500 bonus or whatever dollar amount it was. But I think this kind of goes back to just being a great leader is getting to know your people and understanding what motivates them. And I think there's a place for both sides of what we've talked about. It's the money motivated if you understand what they're going to use that money for and what it means for them and their family. But then the other side is the career progression and helping them develop their sales skills. And so I think it's both sides of those things.
Awesome. Ross, I really enjoyed this conversation. It was very human
Yeah.
focused and people centric, which ultimately at the end of the day, that's who we
That's what we
are,
are.
right? We're
That's right.
still humans. We're not the robots haven't taken over yet. So
Yeah.
I really appreciate sharing that discussion with you. If folks wanted to learn more about your products or maybe follow you on social, I know you share a bunch of best practices. What are the best URLs or handles to reach you?
Yeah. Catch me on LinkedIn if you like some of the content that we talked about here, but also if you just want to connect and continue the conversation. And if you're looking for a sales platform that can help guide your reps with your sales best practices, come visit us at overquota.ai and see what we're working on there with AI guided selling.
Awesome. Well, Ross, have a wonderful holiday season and hope to see you soon, brother.
Absolutely. Thanks.